Here's a question I want you to sit with before you do anything else today. When was the last time you did something at work that scared you? Not annoyed you, not inconvenienced you, scared you. The kind of scared where your stomach drops a little before you hit send on the email, or walk into the room with big executives, or say the thing out loud. If you can't remember, this episode today is for you. I used to think the biggest threat to a career was falling behind, missing the trend, not learning the tool fast enough. And for a while, that was true. It's not anymore. The biggest threat to your career right now isn't AI. It isn't the org chart. It isn't the next reorg or the next platform shift. It's comfort. Specifically, it's the comfort of being excellent at work that no longer requires you. Today, I'm going to take you into 3 coaching rooms I sat in over the past several weeks. A technology executive, an operator who became her company's answer for everything, and a founder whose growth exposed her fastest, not her worst. I'm going to tell you about the year I almost let this happen to me, in my office with my name on the door. And I'm going to give you a framework I call the operational matrix, so you can see in your own calendar exactly where you've traded your future for your comfort. This is Holding the Room. I'm Melissa Sierra. Let's get into it. If you're new here, here's what you need to know about me before we start, because it changes how you should listen to everything that follows. I'm not a coach who left the corporate world behind to go talk about it from a stage. I'm still in it. Right now, today, I sit inside a business intelligence function at a media organization, in real meetings, carrying real headcount, living inside the same AI-driven disruption I'm about to describe to you. And on nights and weekends, I coach senior leaders and founders through exactly this problem. I tell you that because most leadership content is written by people who used to operate and now only observe. I still operate. Everything you're about to hear, the frameworks, the stories, the discomfort, I have either lived it in the last 12 months or watched it happen in a coaching room in the last 12 days. Here's the premise for today's episode. And I want to say it plainly because I think we've gotten sloppy with how we talk about this. Operational excellence. Being reliable. Being the person who delivers. Being the one who never drops the ball used to be a career strategy. It was enough. You could ride competence alone from your 20s into the corner office. That era is over. Not because competence stopped mattering, because competence stopped being scarce. AI didn't come for your job. It came for your margin, the gap between does the work and does the work exceptionally. That margin used to take a career to build. Now, a well-prompted model can close most of it in an afternoon, which means the thing you made valuable, being the most reliable executor in the room, is being commoditized in real time, whether you've noticed it or not. So what's left? What can't be automated, delegated, or prompted into existence? Judgment. Pattern recognition across context a model has never seen, because They only exist in your organization's politics and history. Trust that took years to build and can't be faked. The willingness to say the uncomfortable thing in the room when everyone else is nodding. That's the new differentiator. And I want to be honest with you. Building that is harder than being excellent at your job ever was. It requires you to be a beginner again, in public and on purpose. And most high performers would rather do anything else. That's what today is about. And I want to name the discomfort in the room before we go any further. Because I think pretending it isn't there is dishonest. And I don't do dishonest on this microphone. If you're listening to this in your car or on the way to a job you're good at, some part of what I just said probably landed as a threat. Good. Let it. Threat is just information your nervous system delivers faster than your brain does. The leaders I respect most aren't the ones who never feel that spike. They're the ones who learned not to flinch away from it. Here's my promise for our time today. No vague inspiration, no just believe in yourself. I'm going to hand you a way of seeing your own calendar that you cannot unsee once you have it. 3 real coaching rooms that will show you what this looks like in a body, not a slide deck, and one story from my own career I still find slightly uncomfortable to tell. Let's start where I always start with clients, not with the fix, but with the pattern. Let's zoom in to my leadership laboratory this week. Every week, I sit across from somewhere between 4 and 8 leaders. Some informal coaching engagements, some in exploratory conversations with people still deciding whether coaching is even right for them. I don't go looking for a theme. The theme finds me. And this week, it found me hard. I had 3 separate conversations. 3 different industries, 3 different levels of seniority. 1 enterprise technology leader. 1 operations executive. 1 founder. And by Thursday, I realized I was having the same conversation on a loop with different names attached. Here's the pattern, stated as simply as I can. Every one of these people was excellent at the work that was quietly becoming less valuable, and terrified of work that was quietly becoming essential. Not incompetent, not lazy, not behind. The opposite. They'd built entire identities and reputations on being the most dependable person in the building. And dependability, done at that level for long enough, becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls you toward more of the same, more execution, more let me handle it, more being the answer. I have a name for that gravitational field, and I call it the operational matrix. And I think it's the single most underdiagnosed threat to senior careers right now. It doesn't show up in exit interviews as the matrix got me. It shows up as burnout, as a vague sense of being stuck despite good performance reviews, as leaders quietly wondering why the promotion they were promised 2 cycles ago keeps sliding. Nobody actually names the mechanism. So it keeps operating, generation after generation of high performers, undiagnosed. So let's talk about this operational matrix. Here's how I describe it to clients. Picture 2 kinds of work living inside your calendar every single week. The first kind is the matrix work. This is the work that keeps today's machine running. The meetings, the fires, the deliverables, the things that would generate a very uncomfortable phone call if you stop doing them tomorrow. Matrix work is necessary. It is also, almost by definition, work the organization has already fully priced. It's expected. It's measured. It's the baseline you were hired to clear. The second kind is future self work. This is the work that doesn't show up on anyone's dashboard, that nobody is explicitly asking you for, that has no deadline and no immediate payoff, and that is quietly building the leader, the reputation, and the option set you'll need 18 months from now. Learning to work publicly with AI instead of privately. Writing down your viewpoint instead of just having one. Building relationships outside your reporting line. Saying yes to the stretch assignment that makes you look like a beginner for a quarter. Here is the trap, and I want you to really hear this. Matrix work feels like progress because you can see it moving. Future self work feels like nothing is happening because from the inside, for a while, nothing visibly is. Organizations are optimization machines. Every incentive around you, your manager's calendar invite, your performance review cycle, the Slack message that needs an answer in the next 10 minutes, is built to pull you deeper into the matrix. Nobody's going to protect your future self-work for you. That has to be a deliberate act of resistance. So the question I now open almost every coaching engagement is this. Look at your last 2 weeks of the calendar. Of the hours that were fully yours to allocate, not fires, not the fixed meetings, the discretionary hours. How many of them built today's business? And how many of them built tomorrow's you? Most leaders, when they actually run this audit, are stunned by the number. It's rarely 50-50. It's usually closer to 98 to 2. And that 2% is the entire margin between the leader you are and the leader you're going to need to become. I want to be precise about something because I've seen this framework get flattened into work hard on the right things, which it isn't. The matrix isn't lazy work. Some of the most exhausting, high stakes, generally impressive work you'll ever do is matrix work. David's 15 years of flawless technical firefighting was matrix work. It required real skill. It was also eventually a ceiling because the organization had already learned exactly what to expect from it. An expectation is where a value gets flattened into salary. Here's a distinction I use in every single coaching intake now. Ask not, is this hard, but is this expected? Hard and expected can coexist. And when they do, you are doing excellent matrix work, necessary, respected, and capped. Future self-work often isn't even hard in the traditional sense. It's uncomfortable in a completely different way because there's no rubric for it yet. Nobody can tell if you're doing it right because if they could, it would already be matrix work. Let me show you what this looks like in 3 real rooms. For this first story, we're going to talk about the executive who was always right. I'm going to call him David. Senior technology executive, nearly 2 decades at a company most of you would recognize my name if I said it. which is exactly why I won't. 15 years into that career, David had built something genuinely rare, a reputation for being the person in the room who had the answer, not an answer, the answer. Engineers escalated to him because he'd untangled in 20 minutes what had stalled the team for 2 days. Executives called him into meetings specifically because his read on a technical risk was more reliable than anyone else's in the building. When he came to me, it wasn't because anything had gone wrong. That's important because most people wait for crisis. David came to me because something felt wrong, but he couldn't name it. We spent the first session just mapping his week. And about 20 minutes in, he said something I still think about. I used to feel relief when I solved a problem. Now I feel this low-grade dread, like I'm running out clock on something. I asked him, well, what changed? He said his team had started using an AI coding assistant for the exact class of problem he'd built his reputation solving. The gnarly, half-documented, only David knows why this system does this problems. It wasn't perfect, but it was fast enough and right enough often that the 2-day escalation chain that used to end at his desk was starting to resolve before it ever reached him. Here's what was actually happening underneath the surface panic. David's identity had fused with being the answer, not with being a good leader, not with developing his team, not with strategic judgment, with being the fastest, most reliable source of the correct technical answer in the building. And that specific asset, the one thing he had spent 15 years compounding, was the exact asset AI was built to commoditize first. This is where I used the listen framework with him, because David didn't need motivation. He needed clarity. We started with look. What is actually happening here without the story you're telling yourself about it? Interpret. What does this mean? And what does it not mean? Separate. Which part of this are fact and which parts are fear dressed up as fact? When we separated out, the fact was a category of problem solving he used to own exclusively now had a faster first responder. The fear dressed up as fact was, I'm becoming obsolete. Those are not the same sentence, but David had been living inside the second one for months without ever saying it out loud to anyone. Not his manager, not his wife, no one. That's the part that gets me every time in this work. Brilliant people quietly convinced they're becoming irrelevant, telling absolutely no one. We spent the next several sessions on test and explore, testing what his actual differentiated value looked like once you removed fastest to the answer from the equation, and exploring what work he'd been avoiding because he was so good at the work that made him feel needed. What we found was that David was an exceptional judge of which technical risks actually mattered to the business and which were just noise, a completely different skill from solving the technical problem itself. Nobody had ever asked him to lead with that. He never had to. Being the answer was easy, and it was the identity everyone around him kept reinforcing. His next promotion conversation, 6 months later, wasn't about his technical depth at all. It was about the fact that he'd started running a monthly technical risk briefing for the executive team, his own initiative, unglamorous, invisible to almost everyone except the people who mattered, where he translated energy, engineering, reality into business judgment. That's future self-work. Nobody put it on his goals. He built it in the 2%. I want to add one more detail because it's the part David almost didn't tell me. The first time he ran that briefing, it went badly. He over-explained the technical layer to a room that wanted the business layer. Watched two executives check their phone 4 minutes in and left the room convinced he'd embarrassed himself in front of exactly the people he was trying to earn credibility with. Most people would have quietly let that initiative die right there, told themselves it wasn't really his lane, and gone back to what he knew he was good at. David didn't. He asked one executive afterward, directly, what would have made it useful to her? She told him. He rebuilt the format around her answer. The second briefing landed. That's the part of future self-work nobody puts in the highlight reel. The version where it doesn't work yet. And you do it again anyway. I want to pause on something because I don't want you to hear David's story and think this episode is all about AI's coming for your job. Panic accordingly. That's not it. And frankly, I think that framing has done real damage. It's kept smart people paralyzed instead of moving. Here's the more honest version. AI accelerates execution for everyone, indiscriminately. It doesn't care if you're brilliant or mediocre. It makes the mediocre faster and the brilliant faster. And it closes the visible gap between them in the process, which means the thing that used to separate a good performer from a great one, raw execution speed and technical correctness, is losing its power to differentiate anyone. What's left standing on the other side of that leveling is exactly what a model cannot manufacture on its own. Curiosity that asks the question nobody thought to ask. Pattern recognition built from years of context a system has never seen. Trust earned slowly but spent carefully. Communication that lands in a room full of people with competing incentives. And decision-making under real, consequential uncertainty. Not the tidy uncertainty of a benchmark, the messy kind, with your name attached to the outcome. Those 5 things don't show up on a performance review template yet. Most companies haven't caught up, but I promise you, the leaders already investing there are the ones who will be running the room in 3 years, while everyone else is still competing to be the fastest human in a race the machines have already won. Let's pivot to the second story. I want to share with you all starts with a compliment that was actually a warning sign, though nobody heard it in that way at the time. I'll call my client Renata, operations executive, mid-market company, and by every account, the most indispensable person in her building. People didn't say, ask Renata, the way you'd suggest an option. They said it in a way you'd state a fact, like gravity. Client escalation? Renata. Cross-functional deadlock? Renata. New hire needs to understand how anything actually works around here versus how the org chart claims it? Renata. every time. When she first described her role to me, she used a phrase that stopped me cold. I'm basically the operating system this place runs on. She said it with pride. It took a few sessions before she could hear it as a warning sign. Here's the thing about being the operating system. Operating systems don't get promoted. They get depended on. There's a difference, and it's brutal. Because dependability at that level actually works against you at the exact moment you need it to work for you. Renata's calendar was wall-to-wall problem solving. She hadn't taken a real vacation in 2 years because nothing worked without her. And nothing worked without her because she had built it that way. Not maliciously, but because being needed felt like being valued. And for a long time, it was easier not to examine the difference. The reframe we worked through together was architect versus operating system. An operating system runs every process personally, in real time, forever. An architect designs the systems, builds the people who run them, and then, this is the part that terrified her, steps back far enough that the whole thing keeps working without her in the room. I asked her directly, if you took 3 weeks off right now, no laptop, would the business survive? She said, yes, technically, but it would be chaos and everyone would resent her for it. I said, that's not a yes. That's a hostage situation with better branding. We used the 3C framework here because Renata's blocker wasn't skill. It was nerve. Curiosity. What would it actually look like to build a team that didn't need her for every decision? Not in theory. Specifically, which 3 decisions could she document and delegate this month? Clarity. What was she actually optimizing for? Being needed or being valued? These sound similar. They are not the same goal, and they lead to opposite calendars. Conviction. Could she tolerate the short, uncomfortable period where things got slightly worse before they got structurally better? Because someone besides her was learning to make the call. That third one was real work. Renata had to sit through 6 weeks of a direct report making decisions slightly different than she would have. Not wrong, just distant, different. And resist the urge to override every single one of them. That discomfort is the entire price of becoming an architect instead of remaining the operating system. Most people quit paying it around week 2, right before it would have paid off. Her calendar changed first. This is always the leading indicator before anything else moves. Fewer meetings where she was the only person who could unblock a decision. More time in rooms about where the business was going, not how today's fire got put out. And her opportunities followed the calendar, not the other way around. 6 months in, she was in conversations about a P&L role that I would have never found her while she was still indispensable in the old sense. Because the company literally could not have afforded to move her. Being needed and being valuable feel identical from the inside. They produce completely different careers. There's a coda to Renata's story I think about often. About 4 months into the shift, one of her newly empowered direct reports made a call Renata genuinely disagreed with. Not a small call, a client-facing one. Old Renata would have overwritten it within the hour. This Renata didn't. She let it play out. It went fine, not perfectly. And afterward, she told me something that I now say to almost every client wrestling with this exact moment. It wasn't the decision I would have made. It was still a good decision. Learning to hold those two sentences at the same time without needing them to collapse into one is most of what becoming an architect actually feels like day to day. It's less dramatic than the word architect implies. It's mostly just tolerating a version of good enough that isn't yours. Notice something about Renata's story. AI barely appears in it directly. And I did that on purpose because I want to make a point. This isn't only an AI story. AI is an accelerant on a fire that was already burning. Leaders who built their value on being the indispensable executor were already vulnerable to any force that could distribute their function more broadly. A great hire, a better process, a reorg. AI just makes that force faster and cheaper than any of those ever were. Renata's shift from operator to architect would have mattered in 2015. It matters more now because the cost of remaining purely operational just dropped to nearly zero. I'd go a step further, actually. The leaders who use AI most effectively right now aren't the ones who've mastered the most prompts. They're the ones who've gotten honest, fastest about which parts of their job were always more replaceable than their ego wanted to admit. That's not a comfortable sentence, but it's an accurate one. And accuracy is worth more than comfort every time in this work. The third conversation was a prospect call. Not a formal engagement yet, and I'm including it because it crystallized something I've been circling in my own writing for a while now. Growth doesn't fix what's broken in a business or a leader. It amplifies what is already there, strengths and weaknesses both, at the same volume. I'll call her Tina. Founder, growth stage company, headcount had roughly tripled in 18 months. Revenue was climbing fast enough that from the outside, everything looked like a success story with a bow on it. She came to me exhausted and slightly ashamed of being exhausted because, in her own words, everything's going right. So why do I feel like everything's on fire? Here's what I found within about 15 minutes of listening. Tina's founding superpower was speed of decision. In 1 year, with 6 people, that was the whole company's competitive advantage. She'd decide, the team would move, and by the time a competitor had scheduled a meeting about the decision, Tina's team had already shipped and learned from it fast, indistinct, correct enough to matter. At 60 people, that same instinct, the identical trait, completely unchanged, was quietly breaking her company. Decisions she made alone at 11 p.m. were now overriding frameworks 3 different teams had spent weeks building. Her speed, which used to be a gift she gave the company, had become a tax everyone else was paying without being told the rate. This is exactly the pattern I've been writing about. Growth doesn't solve your problems. It puts a magnifying glass over them and hands the magnifying glass to everyone watching. Tina's strengths and her weakness were the same trait, viewed at different scale. Nobody had told her that, because at 6 people, nobody had reason to. We used listen together, starting with look and name. Naming specifically which of her instincts were still assets at 60 people and which had quietly flipped into liabilities without her noticing the crossover point. That's the hardest part of this work for founders. There is rarely a dramatic moment where strength becomes a weakness. It's a gradient. And by the time it's obvious to everyone else in the building, it's usually been obvious to them for months. What Tina was actually afraid of once we dug past the exhaustion wasn't losing control of decisions. It was this: if she stopped being the fastest decision maker in the room, what was she for? That question, what am I for? Versus what I've always been, in my experience, the real engine underneath almost every leadership plateau I've ever coached someone through. It was underneath David's story. It was underneath Renata's. It's underneath most of what looks like a performance problem and is actually an identity problem wearing a performance problem's clothes. We're early in the work together, so I won't pretend this one has a tidy resolution yet. But the first shift already happened in that first call. Tina named out loud for the first time that the thing making her company successful and the thing making her miserable were the exact same trait. You cannot fix what you won't name. That's the whole first letter of listen. And it's usually the one people skip because naming it out loud makes it real. This is also, by the way, the exact thesis I've been developing in my own writing lately. And I want to say it directly here because I think it's one of the most misunderstood ideas in leadership. Growth does not solve your problems. It reveals them at scale to an audience that's now large enough to notice it. A 5-person team can absorb a founder's blind spot quickly. A 60-person team cannot. The blind spot didn't get worse. The room got bigger. If you're leading anything that's currently scaling, a team, a function, a company, I want to ask yourself Tina's question before someone else asks it for you. Which of my instincts got me here? And which of them are now costing the people who work for me? And am I willing to find out which is which before growth makes the answer obvious to everyone but me? Here's what connects David, Renata, and Tina, and it's the concept I built the second half of my practice around. I call it the Opportunity Flywheel. Most people think opportunity is something that happens to you. A tap on the shoulder, a lucky introduction, being in the right room at the right time. I don't believe that. 15 years of watching careers up close has convinced me it's actually a mechanism. And mechanisms can be built. Here's how the flywheel turns. It starts with position. Doing the small, often invisible piece of future self-work that nobody assigned to you. The 2% I described earlier. It builds visibility. not self-promotion, but the natural earned visibility of having actually done something worth noticing. Visibility creates trust because people extend opportunity to those they've already watched perform in a smaller, lower stakes version of the bigger thing. And trust generates the next opportunity, which, if you take it, requires new position work, and the wheel turns again, faster each rotation because trust compounds. David's flywheel started turning the moment he built that monthly risk briefing nobody asked for. Renata's started turning the moment she survived 6 uncomfortable weeks of not overriding her team. Tina's is just starting with one honest sentence spoken out loud in a coaching call. Here's the part people get wrong. They wait for opportunity to appear before they'll do the position work. That's backwards. The flywheel only starts moving when you do the unglamorous work first, with no guarantee it will ever be seen. Most people want the 4th stage without ever starting at the first. I understand the impulse. As a type A, I've lived it. One more thing about the flywheel, because I think it's the piece that keeps people stuck longest. It doesn't turn on your timeline. David's briefing took 2 attempts and 6 months to become a promotion conversation. Renata's calendar shift took most of a year to become a P&L conversation. It's not a flaw in the mechanism. It's the mechanism. Trust is the slowest compounding asset in any career, which is exactly why it's the hardest one for a competitor, a market shift, or a language model to take from you once you've actually built it. Speed was never the point. Direction was. I want to tell you the version of this story I don't tell from stages very often because it isn't the most flattering one. There was a year in my corporate career. I won't tell you exactly when, but if you've been in leadership for a while, you'll recognize the shape of it. Where I was, by every external measure, having the best year of my career. I mean, delivering. Genuinely delivering. The kind of quarter where you walk into the leadership review and people are actually impressed. Not politely, impressed. I had built a reputation as the person who could take something chaotic and turn it into something that worked. Does that sound familiar? It's David's story. It's Renata's story. I lived it before I ever coached anyone through it. Here's the moment that cracked it open for me, and I remember it with an uncomfortable amount of precision. I was in a room, a good room, a room I'd worked years to get access to, presenting a result I was genuinely proud of. And a more senior leader, someone I respected, said something meant as a compliment. I don't know what we'd do without you running this. I smiled. I said thank you. And on the drive home that night, that sentence sat in my chest like a stone because some part of me understood before I could put words to it that being unable to imagine the business without me was actually not a compliment. It was a ceiling with excellent lighting. I went home and I did something I'd never done before. I pulled up my calendar for the previous 3 months and just looked at it. Not analytically at first, just looked. The way you'd look at a photo of yourself and notice you'd aged more than you realized. And what I saw was a person who had built an extraordinary machine for running today's business and had not spent a single deliberate hour in 90 days building the leader she was going to need to be in 3 years. Every hour was matrix work, every single one. Without ever deciding to, I had become a part of the very system I was supposed to be leading. That's the night the operational matrix stopped being a concept I could explain to clients and became something I'd actually lived through and could speak to with the weight it deserves. I didn't quit my job. I didn't have some dramatic reinvention montage. What I did was smaller and slower and honestly scarier in its own way. I started giving away work I was good at on purpose to make room for work I was terrible at in public, in front of those people whose respect I spent years earning. I started writing down my point of view instead of just having one inside my head. I said yes to a stretch conversation that made me feel like first year again, at a level where nobody expects you to feel that way. That discomfort, the specific identity level discomfort of being visibly a beginner again after building a reputation for excellence, is now what I believe the actual price of admission to whatever comes next in a career. Nobody warned you about it because it doesn't show up on a performance review. It shows up in the mirror on a Tuesday for no reason you can point to. I'll be honest about the part that came after because I don't think the story is complete without it. Giving away work I was good at didn't feel noble in the moment. It felt like losing status I had worked hard to earn. There were meetings in that first stretch where I sat quietly while somebody else took a swing at the problem I could have solved faster myself. And I had to physically stop my hand from raising. Vaden calls that kind of moment a priority dilution, the gap between what you know and what you choose to do about it in real time. And I don't think there's a framework that makes that gap painless. There's only practice at closing it anyway, on purpose, on a Tuesday, when nobody's watching and nothing's forcing you to. That year eventually led me here, to this microphone, to the coaching practice, to speaking, to the flywheel itself, which I built explicitly because I never wanted another leader to have to discover this alone the way I did at 11 o'clock at night, staring at a calendar that looked nothing like the person I actually wanted to become. Let's focus on the 5 to focus on this week's episode. So let's make this concrete. I'm not going to leave you with a feeling. I'm going to leave you with 5 actions. I call this 5 to focus on, and I want you to actually do these things, not just nod along. Number 1, position. This week, find the place in your work where comfort has quietly become your strategy. Not where you're struggling, where you're coasting. That's exactly the exact spot where the matrix has the tightest grip on you. Because coasting feels like competence from the inside. A practical way to find it. Think of the task you complete fastest, with the least anxiety that still earns you praise. That's not always your strength speaking. Sometimes it's your comfort zone wearing your strengths clothes. Number 2, prioritize. Take one uncomfortable action before Friday. Not a 5-year plan, one action. Send the message you've been drafting for 2 weeks. Volunteer for the project that makes you feel slightly out of your depth. David's monthly briefing started with one action, not a strategy. If you can't think of one, ask yourself, what have you been quietly avoiding? Because you'd have to be visibly bad before you got good. That's usually the right one. Number 3, prepare. Build capacity before opportunity arrives, not after. Renata didn't wait for permission to start training her team to make decisions without her. She built that capacity on a Tuesday nobody was watching, so it was already there when the P&L conversation eventually showed up. Preparation done after the opportunity appears isn't preparation. It's a scramble with better lighting, and rooms can tell the difference. Number 4, promote. Make your thinking visible. This is the one high performers resist hardest because it feels like bragging, but it isn't. It's the difference between being brilliantly private and being trusted publicly. Write the point of view down. Say it in the meeting instead of just knowing it's true. Tina's whole shift started with a single sentence spoken out loud that she'd been carrying silently for months. Visibility doesn't require a platform. It requires a sentence said to the right person at the right moment instead of being held. Number 5, perform. But I mean this specifically as reflect and refine, not execute harder. Every week, run the calendar audit I described earlier. Matrix hours versus future self hours. Don't judge the number the first time you see it. Just look at it. Awareness is the entire first turn of the flywheel. I'd rather you run this audit honestly and feel uncomfortable about the result than skip it because you suspect what it'll say. The suspicion is usually accurate, and it's not going anywhere until you name it. Position, prioritize, prepare, promote, perform. 5 words, 1 calendar, applied weekly for the rest of your career. Before you go back to your day, I want you to do the one thing I did that night in my car. Except I want you to do it now, on purpose, instead of waiting for a compliment to accidentally show you the truth. Open your calendar, look at the last 2 weeks, and ask yourself honestly, how much of that time built today's success, and how much of it built tomorrow's leader? I'm not going to tell you the answer needs to be 50-50. It rarely is, and it doesn't need to be, not this month. But if the answer is closer to 0, I want you to hear this clearly, because it's the whole point of the hour we've just spent together. Comfort isn't the enemy. You're allowed to be good at your job. You're allowed to feel competent, to be relied on, to be excellent at the work in front of you. Staying there, that's the risk. Comfort as a resting place is fine. Comfort as a career strategy is how brilliant people quietly disappear. One dependable, unremarkable, perfectly executed day at a time. Think about David. 6 months from now, still known as the fastest technical mind in the building, but now also known as the person the executive team trusts to tell them what actually matters. Think about Renata, no longer the operating system, finally being considered for the role the old version of her job could have never made room for her. Think about Tina, still building fast, but building fast with a team that no longer has to guess which decisions are actually hers. to override. None of them became different people. They became willing to be beginners again on purpose in the specific places where beginning was overdue. You don't need a 5-year plan to start this. You need 2% and the willingness to feel behind on purpose for a while. That's the whole ask. Find the 2%. Start the flywheel. And I'll see you next week. This is Holding the Room, and I'm Melissa Sierra.